Does this talk automatically? I don't have to do anything with this, do I?
Just stay in your pocket. It's on, and
Okay.
now you're not leashed to the computer.
Okay. All right. Well, Larry called and he said he needed a fall guy. I thought he said he needed a field guy. So I'm here, but the truth is, last Friday we were mowing. Larry was driving the big mower out in the field, and he ran over what we think was Big Bird, and he's Big Bird. There was feathers everywhere, and I think he's a little concerned that if he came in, he'd get stoned by the kids over in the nurseries. Besides, it's a happy hour, those cuckoos. Anyway, I get my hammering in on him. All righty. Last time I did this, we were talking about the Greek philosophers, and that we brought that up. So I brought a timeline in here this time, you could see. And on the top, we see events that are happening in the Bible. On the bottom, we see events that are happening in what's typically world history. So we see that Israel goes into captivity. We see that we've got, well, you can read yourself. You see the 586 temple, the first temple's raised. They go into Babylonian captivity. And these mark the beginning of what is known as the Jewish diaspora. And that's when they started to scatter all over the world. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. But that continued all the way up into 1947 when they became a nation again. All right. Also, I have up there where some of the books are written, Daniel, Nehemiah, and Malachi. And as y'all know, in Nehemiah, they came back and began to reconstruct the temple. That's the second temple, and it began right about there. All right. In addition, last week, or last time I talked, we were talking about a guy by the name Heraclitus, who was a Greek philosopher, and he noticed that things were changing, and that the change was something that there was an intelligence behind it, and he called that intelligence logos. And so logos comes through us all the way to today, where we have in the beginning of John, in the first line of John, the beginning was the word. Logos means word. Word was with us, and so forth. The point here is that it means more than just word. It means an intelligence. Then, just as a point of interest of history, in 480 there was a battle at Thermopylae, and if y'all ever, maybe there was a movie about 20 years ago called The 300. And it was about Leonidas, who is a Greek Spartan, and his 300 guys took on a horde of Persians at Thermopylae. This is actually true. And he was fighting a Persian king by the name of Xerxes. Now, biblical quiz. Who was Xerxes' favorite wife? Who?
Esther.
Esther, yeah. Actually goes by a little different name in the Bible. So that kind of ties that there. Then we moved over to the Greek philosophers. Socrates was the first one, and he kind of got the ball rolling. Plato was the philosopher who's considered the father of reason. And then we have Aristotle, who is considered to be the father of material science type of reasoning and looking at it. Out of that, if y'all remember, I closed with having a dollar bill, and I said to a person of science it was just a piece of paper with printing on it. To a person of reason, it was a Federal Reserve note. But what really makes it work is faith, and that's where we come in. That faith is really the driver, because we believe in things that are seen, that are not seen yet. In this work, I want to bring us work on this a little bit. In this world we live in right now, if you talk to people, almost all of them of the worldly sort, they'll tell you that they got to have something absolutely tangible before they would believe that there's a God. And if you ever kind of witness to them, and sometimes that'll be an argument that they'll come up with, well, give me some proof. That's really no different than ancient Roman having to have an idol to touch. They have to have something material. As Daniel pointed out, that's something that they can control. So these things go from all the way back then, and they're carried forward even to today. I don't care how sophisticated the man thinks he is, that they're just following what they did, the pagans did 3,000 years ago. All righty, now I'm going to continue a little bit further and show you how to start tying all this together. After Aristotle was contemporaneous with a fellow by the name of Philip of Macedon, and Philip of Macedon managed to take all the Greek city-states, put them together into a nation. He died, and his son was Alexander the Great. Aristotle was Alexander the Great's tutor, and he taught him and several of his buddies. And Philip of Macedon set all this up. So after Philip died and Alexander took over, he began a conquest of, actually he went east from Greece. He took Turkey, then he went down through Palestine and into Egypt. Then he came back up through Egypt, over through Syria and Iraq, Syria and Iraq, down to Persia, up through all the way over to Afghanistan and down into Pakistan, and finally came home. So he was quite a conqueror, and we'll move over to that right now. So kind of give you a time frame how this stuff's working. Any questions? All righty, let's see. Yep. Well, we're not clicking here very well, Gary. I don't know what, there we go.
Well, it's changing on you now.
There it is. Okay, got the tempo. Okay. All right, getting back there to Alexander the Great. He was, as I've written here, he and his buddies were educated by Aristotle, and then in 10 years he conquered a huge chunk of the world. I'll show you a map in a minute. His battle record, never lost a battle, 13-0. He died at age 33. They think he was poisoned. They really don't know. He was buried or interned at a crypt in Alexandria, Egypt. Somewhere along the way in history, it was lost. They don't know where his body is now. Or any, after he died, they divided his empire up amongst a bunch of his generals. And these were his buddies back when he was in school with Aristotle. And some of his buddies were really nice. Anyway, they divided up into 5 sections, and the 2 that were of interest to us biblically are Seleucus and Ptolemy. Then Alexander was married. He had a really evidently knockout wife by the name of Roxana. She was had a child by him, but after Alexander died, she was given under the protection of Cassander, who was the hegemon of Greece, and he murdered her because he didn't want to have more rivals. So that's the way they played the game in that day. Some friend, huh? Okay. Now we have a bunch of references here for Daniel. You can find them in your Bible, 11:3-4, and where he predicts where Daniel's given a prediction. Remember, Daniel's about 300 years upstream of this date. So you got 11:3 there. Yeah. Anyway.
A mighty king shall stand up and shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will.
Okay. Read 4 too while you at it.
And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken and shall be divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be plucked up, even for others besides those.
Okay, thank you. So he divided the kingdom up amongst all these generals, and again, his progeny was killed by Cassander. So we can see 300 years before, Daniel making this prediction. I thought it's interesting. Okay, all right. Now we have a picture here of his empire. And like I said, he went east, he didn't go west. So we see all this area here that he conquered around in there. And then just over there to your far right is a map of the Roman Empire. And you can see how it's all the way around there. Now, why is that significant? Can anybody give me a? Well, yeah, this would be, well, I'll just tell you what happened. All in Alexander's empire, Greek became the predominant language. Also, remember I mentioned the Jewish diaspora? Well, the Jews were following in sort of in Alexander's footsteps. When he founded a city, a small group of Jews tended to move there, and they set up a synagogue, and they began preaching monotheism. Or I would say preaching it, they were an example of monotheism. All the world was pagan, remember, at this time, except for mainly the Jews. So now you can see God's plan working, because here Alexander goes up, he sets out all these capitals. I think there are 22 cities named Alexandria. And here come the Jews right behind them. They set up their synagogues. They begin to expose all these pagan cultures to monotheism. And even to this day, there are Jewish enclaves in some of these currently Muslim lands. So that's some of the significance of Alexander.
Why did the Jews follow Alexander?
Well, they had been basically the Palestine, Israel, and Judah had been blown up by the Syrians and then Babylonians. And they didn't take everybody back into captivity. A lot of them, they just fled. And the reason they followed into Alexander's footsteps, the way I understand it, was mainly commercial reasons. They could make money. Not a very noble thing, but that was it. And this thing goes all the way to this day. Okay, so, yes, ma'am. Linda?
Do you have a mic? Are you using a microphone? Well, I'm having trouble hearing you.
Okay. How's that? Okay. Anyway, as I explained, some of the significance of this is, can you hear now?
Yeah, good now. You're gonna have to go back and repeat all of that.
Y'all really want that? All right. So the significance, how about y'all online? Are y'all awake out there? All right. Okay. Again, to highlight the reasons of Alexander's legacy was that Greek culture was spread to all these countries. And the New Testament was written in what? Greek. Coined Greek languages. Well, I just wrote it right there. Coined Greek language using the language of the New Testament. There were 20 cities named Alexandria, but Alexandria, Egypt's going to show up in a little while and later as a very important city. I mentioned to you the diaspora Jews moved to these cities of conquests, and Alexander were all conquests were to the east of Palestine. But if you look over on the Roman map over there, it's all pretty nearly all to the west. So between the two of them, you're going to find this situation where the diaspora Jews spread to the east and they spread to the west. And all this time they're taking with them monotheism, and what a lot of people considered the Jews, well, they may probably still do today, it's kind of peculiar about the way they held to the religion. So it set a kind of a chain in motion here that began to cause some to question the value of paganism and multiple gods here. So just a new thing that they hadn't thought about. There's some dissatisfaction in the world at this time over having a polytheistic gods that weren't effective. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, yeah. So the Roman Empire was going to the east and the
West.
and the west, and the Greeks were going to the east.
Right.
And it was roughly the same time period.
No. The Roman Empire is going to kick in here pretty soon. I'll get to that in the next slide. But what happened after he died, it split into these, was divided up amongst his buddies, and then they started fighting with each other. These people, they fought all the time. It was just one thing after another. But the two societies, or two hegemons that were, these kings that were running these areas were called hegemons, which from we get the word hegemony, where you kind of bully another nation. For instance, Russia would be a hegemon of Poland before the wall fell. Okay, you with me there? Okay, these hegemons, there were two of them that are going to be significant to us. One is Seleucids, which was over in Persia area, and then the Ptolemies, which had Palestine and Egypt. For a while, they got fighting each other and it changed hands. Anyway, after they started fighting with each other after he died, and Cleopatra, everybody know who Cleopatra is. I'm not talking about Elizabeth Taylor here. She was actually Greek. She wasn't Egyptian. Okay. She well, Richard Burton wasn't exactly Roman either, but anyway, okay. All right. Hard thing about doing this is you can't, all these things are kind of like interrelated. They're like this, they're not like this. You have to teach it in a line, one thing after another, but in reality, they're all kind of overlapping. Anyway, we talked about the diaspora. I'm going to repeat again, since Israel was basically blown up in 722 when they lost, the northern kingdom Israel lost to the Syrians, marched off to captivity, and then Judah was marched off into Babylon about 100 years later, I guess. By the first century Roman times, there were 3.5 million Jews scattered out all over Alexander's old kingdom in the Roman Empire, but there were about 1 million in Israel, Palestine area that we're familiar with. So you kind of think that in your mind. You got to imagine that. We just focus on what we read in the Bible in that little area of Palestine, but it's really a different picture when you think there's 3.5 million Jews scattered out all over. All of them are demonstrating to people monotheism, and they're beginning to, it's setting the stage. So you see God's hand playing in all this, don't you? I mean, right? He gets Alexander to take all that country to the east. The Jews follow. Then he takes all that country to the Romans take all the country to the west. The Jews go out in that area. And then along comes Christ, and then, of course, eventually Paul and the apostles, and they spread this thing all out. So God had been preparing the world all along for Christ's Christianity to spread throughout the world. So we study history. Anyway, because they were blown up, the Jews they weren't temple centric anymore. They became concerned. The religious concern was a synagogue. That would be like our church now still today. They worship at a synagogue. And if you read in Acts, when first thing Paul did when he hit town, they went to the synagogue to preach, right? First to the Jews, then to the Gentiles. So again, we see God's hand there planning these things for the setting the stage for this for Christianity. Okay, well, I mentioned that about the pagans were introduced to monotheism. Alexandria, Egypt, this would have been about 100 years after Alexander died. It was under Ptolemy rule, And there was a Ptolemy II, and he was a big academic. He liked books, and he set up a humongous library there. The Jews came, and have always been a people that were interested in intellectual stuff. And so it became this kind of busy place for study and academic pursuits, and one thing after another. It became the largest population of Jews I think in the world, even more than in Jerusalem at the time. So again, kind of picture that in your mind. That's not what you think when you think about from what you see in the Bible. Okay, any questions? Please. Okay, all right. Yes, ma'am, Linda.
Okay, and as you're talking about the conquest of Alexander the Great
Mhm.
and the spread of the Roman Empire, part of what God was planning was not so much fighting among the smaller countries, because there was relative peace after the conquest, right? And they were building of roads like from the Romans, so that it was easier to travel. Those are ways that God was getting the world ready for Jesus, right?
Correct.
Are there any other ideas?
I can't say it was a direct thing, but it would certainly, you could deduce that.
Are there any others?
No, those are the two that just predated Jesus. There were other conquests all through history. The Persians and the Greeks fought back and forth for centuries. And then after this period, the Roman Empire went on, and then in 380 it divided into the Eastern and Western. Actually, it divided sometimes and then go back together and go, but permanently it divided in 380. And the 380 AD. And one part, the Western Empire, which is Rome as we know it, went to 476 and Rome fell. But the Eastern Empire, which was based in Byzantium or Constantinople, or I don't know what they call it now, it's in Turkey, Istanbul. That guy ran until 1543. So that the Roman Empire went from about 200 BC to 1543. That's 1700 years. They just called it by a different name. They call it the Byzantine Empire. But the important thing about it, getting back to the fighting, the Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire fought the Persians for years and years and years and years. I mean, it was way up to the 700s. And what finally happened, they beat themselves to a pulp. And about this time, here came Muhammad. Muhammad and the Islam movement, and the people that could help hold him in check were just basically worn out. So that's how it got going and spread. But we'll talk about that later. That's another 400, 500 years in the future. Okay. So these are the world history events I'm trying to get across that sets us up. Okay. All righty. I kind of stumbled into this anyway. The important thing, one of the important things that happened in Alexandria was, as I mentioned, Ptolemy II was sort of an academic guy, and the Jews came there because they were interested in those sort of pursuits. And they became concerned that the Hebrew language would be lost, and therefore their Old Testament would be lost. And so they talked Ptolemy into sponsoring a translation of the Old Testament into Greek. And this became what was known as Septuagint. And they got the name because they had 70 scholars now went off and translated the Bible, and they came back, and they were all within agreement within a couple of words or something like that. But the Septuagint was a Bible that would have been around in the Christian era. They wrote the New Testament in Greek. They had the Old Testament in Greek. That was the Bible that they used. And the Septuagint is even used today by the Greek Orthodox Church. So it's been around a while. After this period, we're at about 300 BC. And after the Malachi was written, and around this time, the Septuagint was in process, there were the further writings that began to creep in, and these became known as the Apocrypha. Okay. We don't recognize the Apocrypha. It's a bunch of books that were written, Maccabees, I don't know, they got some goofy names. And they're not even recognized by the Jews. We use what's called a Masoretic text for our Bible. Well, it doesn't include the Apocrypha. And it's important to know that between the time of Malachi and the time of Christ, these books were written, but they're not recognized. They're not even referenced by any of the Gentiles. But the Catholics recognize some of them because it supports their business about purgatory and about the Pope. They don't recognize all of them. So this is when this was written. If anybody asks, it's between 300 and Christ.
Translation was from Hebrew to Greek.
Yes. Right. This translation business gets to be a mess after a while. It has a lot of effect. Okay. Now, summarize here. So here's some of the lessons that we can learn from this. If somebody, boy, would you take Psalms 28, please? And Holly, Matthew 6:10. You want to take Paul? You want to take Colossians? And who's got a Bible here? We're going to read some verses here about showing how God controls history. Who's got 10:29? Terry, you want to do Matthew or Nancy? Okay. And Ephesians, somebody hold up to Gary. You look like an Ephesians man. Okay. And Dave, you want to do Matthew 15:19? That ought to cover it. All right. Who was the first victim? Foy. Wait a second. We're talking the first thing, the whole theme of all this, we see how God uses rulers, just like he used Pharaoh. This is what we're talking about here. Okay, go ahead, Foy.
The kingdom is the Lord's, and he rules over the nations.
Right. So he's in control, right? Who's got Matthew, honey?
Your kingdom come, your will be done.
So, all righty. Colossians.
And he is before all things, and by him all things consist.
Okay. All right. Now we see how he controls kings and nations. Let's talk about some of the individual people he uses and characters that he uses. Who's got Matthew 10:29?
Are two sparrows not sold? Two sparrows not sold for. And yet not one of them.
So he knows us all by our hearts, doesn't he? And let's see, Ephesians.
Also, we have obtained an inheritance, having been predestined according to his purpose, who works all things after the counsel of his will.
Right. And who's got 15:19? Anybody? Yes, sir. Okay, sure. No, well, Jeremiah's fine if you got 10:23.
I know, Lord, that a man's way is not in himself, nor is it in man who walks to direct his steps.
Okay. Matthew, Dave, did you get 15:19? Who had Matthew?
Yeah, I've got it here. I can read it. So out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts.
Okay. The reason I brought that up was if you noticed how Alexander's generals behaved after he died. He kept them together long enough. And then after he died, it was in 2 years, they started fighting with each other. And it was like that. Roxana, his wife, he made 2 other political marriages. And after Alexander died, but before she could get back to Greece, she murdered her 2 rivals, or two I don't know what you'd call those, his other 2 wives. She had them murdered. In those days, if you were in some places, if you were where a potentate had a harem and he had a bunch of children by the harem, if once he died and the oldest son took over, all the other males were drowned. So they played it tough in those days. Okay. All righty. Let's go back and let's see if I got anything else. All right, that's it. All right. And I'm go back. Okay, what happened there? Well, darn it. Oh, I kept poking and it did something silly. Okay.
Matthew 19:17 has a good comment where you're working on that. And he said unto him, why callest me thou good? There is none good but one, and that is God.
We have to share it again.
I don't know what I did here. Well, I was going to go back up to the top and go back to the timetable up the top.
It's this one.
It's up to the very top where Tim will go all the way up to the very top of the pile here. Yeah, there you go. Hit that guy. Yeah, that's the guy. Okay. Thank you. Okay. We get back to some of that. You can see how all this stuff sort of like weaves in and out, and it's very hard to take it apart and do it. But all righty. Thanks, Gary. Fortunately, the Zoom meeting kind of hiding things here over to the right. Can y'all see all that pretty well? Yeah, if you can move back over where it covered all this crud on the left. That's fine.
Smaller. You should be able to move it around.
Yeah, move it. Oh, you just doing that? Okay, cool.
Is that good?
Yeah. Okay. Now what I wanted to do is get through the Old Testament stuff here, and all right, and bring us up to the Christian era. Anyway, because kind of going back through all this stuff, we see that again on the top, we see how the Jews are going and getting blown up when they're taken into captivity. Diaspora comes along all the way through to 1947. We see where the books are written that we're familiar with. 420, the Old Testament canon ends with Malachi. But at the same time, down on the bottom, we see that Alexander the Great is beginning his thing. He only had a 10-year run there before he was killed. Not very long. Ptolemy's takeover. They're the first one to take over Palestine. The important thing about Ptolemy was Ptolemy II that set up the library in Alexandria, became an intellectual center, and he was the one that had the Septuagint translated, paid for it, his patron of it. And then they got in a scuffle, and Palestine went over to the Seleucid rule, which is another Greek. Anyway, this time they were kind of getting their culture, they dissipated themselves, beating on each other, basically what it amounted to. and the Romans began to take over. They started around 200 BC. They fought with Carthage. Remember Hannibal and the elephants and that sort of thing? Well, once they beat Carthage, and they came over and started taking on the Greeks, who were pretty weak by then, and they took over around around 65, let's say. It's good enough. They took over Jerusalem, and they began to be the hegemons of Jerusalem. Meantime, there was a revolt in Palestine against the Greek. There was a fellow by Antiochus Epiphanes, and he did some really terrible things in the temple. This started a revolt. The Jews revolted. The Maccabees won. Well, the Maccabees were there for about half a generation. They turned out to be just about as bad as Antiochus Epiphanes. They had another mess. So they're fighting, it's turmoil all the time. Meantime, the Romans just kind of come walking in and say, all right, we're taking this thing over. But the emperor at this time was Augustus, and he'd come out on top on the war with Cleopatra and Mark Antony, backing up. Remember Caesar, Julius Caesar, and they assassinated him in the Ides of March and that sort of stuff. Well, Augustus was his adopted son, and Mark Antony was one of the conspirators. Well, after that, shortly after Julius Caesar was murdered, they go into a civil war, and it ends up being Augustus versus Mark Antony, who had gone down to Egypt. Richard Burton was just drawn like crazy to Elizabeth Taylor, so he goes down there. They get into a clash. Mark Antony loses actually the sea battle, and Augustus gets on top. Augustus is the reigning emperor just at about the time he dies, just about the time Christ is born. Okay, so but his buddy literally was Herod the Great, and they knew each other even before Herod was the king of Israel. Well, when after this mess they get this mess going and down to Palestine, and he needed somebody that understood the complicated politics, just like it is now, like our mess we got into in Afghanistan. They needed to have somebody straighten it out, so he put Herod in charge, kind of as a buffer, because he understood the game. Herod was not a Jew; he was a Hasmonean Jew. He was a Jewish convert, so he puts Herod in charge of that. And Herod is running the show. Again, he dies at about the same time that Christ was born. It was only like less than a year later. So that brings us up to the eve of the New Testament. All right. Anybody got questions? It's a mess. Yes, ma'am.
The thing that strikes me is that the Bible is set in history, and it's explicit, like it names people, it names dates, who was in charge, and it all looks true. The rendition of the history you brought forth has been a kind of a secular one with an overlay of the Jewish history involved in it. So it all intermingles, which should tell the world the truth.
It should. They should. You can classically you share the gospel with somebody, but that's about all you can do. If the Holy Spirit touches them, they may respond, but that's not it's like leading a horse to the water. You can't make him drink. So anyway, any other questions? Boy, you got something there working in your mind. I can tell it from all the way over here. I got your heads buzzing.
Polly mentioned it. I just wondered when Wyatt Earp fit in all this.
He's about 2,000 years that away.
Okay.
All right. Yeah. Oh, I want to mention something about the Romans and these guys. Like this was the way they played in those days. They were conquerors, and when they took over a territory, if the people that they were taking over, if they resisted, they go in there and they they were brutal. And they took all the men that were able, they sold them into slavery, and the women and everything, if they didn't murder them all. On the other hand, if they gave up and gave them fealty, they kind of left them alone, except for taxes and manpower, and they didn't want any trouble. And that was the way the Romans ran their operation. You just didn't mess, as long as you didn't mess with them, and you paid your taxes, which were terrible, and occasionally provided manpower in the way of slavery, they left you alone. You could pretty well do whatever you wanted to do. Huh?
The Jews gave them a lot of trouble. There were always uprisings and they were.
That's right.
They were finicky about anything.
That's right. And the Romans, we're going to probably get into that. They got to the point where they were just like, we're not getting a lot of taxes from these people, and we're getting a lot of trouble. So, hey, and they got fed up with them, and Titus, one of the reasons Titus and Vespasian and Titus leveled them out in 70. Yeah. So you got to keep that in mind, that they fought all the time. It was just the way they played the game in those days. Shows you how violent men are. So anyway, I can see everybody's about halfway asleep. We're about here at the end here. Anything else? All right. Well, let's bow our heads and we'll close. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for this opportunity for us to learn a little bit more of how you guide history toward your own ends. We thank you for all that you've given us and for this wonderful group of people. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Y'all have a good week.
There's none good. No, not